Welcome to our first episode of Let's Talk Nautical. I'm very excited today to be joined by my nautical colleague Marvin and Razvan. My name is Janis Schack. We are passionate about shipping and technology in general, and since we constantly have talks about that, now the idea came up to make it a podcast. So here we are again today. Let's see where we get with this.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Great. The thing that was a lot in the publicity, or had a lot of publicity during the last weeks, let's say, was the one Apus container ship that lost a larger number, or a huge amount of containers during a storm. So I want to throw this on the table, and let's see. What did you guys hear about that?
It's definitely made the news. When you have a large ship losing thousands of containers, especially now during Christmas seasons when everyone is waiting their products. But I would like to kind of take a step back and look a bit at the numbers. I've done some checks, and apparently on average during the last 10 years, you have like around 1,300 containers lost at sea every year. But if you put this number into perspective, the liner shipping companies carry or transport around somewhere north of 200 million containers. So this number of 1,000 plus containers lost at sea, it's like 0.01% of that, I think even less. So I know it makes a lot of headlines, and also it's very easy to start blaming the crew and everything, but if we put the numbers a bit into perspective, I think that it's acceptable and it's normal. Obviously, there was a peak of containers lost at sea, I think in 2013, when we had the MOL Comfort that broke down somewhere in the Indian Ocean, and they lost everything. It's something that it happens. It's a risk, especially with large ships. It's quite difficult to avoid bad weather because people want their goods delivered on time and as cheap as possible. So you can avoid all the bad weather, but then you'll increase a lot the fuel consumption, which will affect the cost of transporting the cargo. So you will this will also affect the price of the product. So in the end, I don't see such a big deal out of it.
I think it's always important to keep it in a relation to the overall traffic that occurs. I think this is the same with every accident. If you just see it as a single thing, it's a huge tragedy and it's a huge loss. In this case, luckily, just monetarily. But all in all, it's a fraction of a percentage of containers that is lost every year. However, also when you said that the average annual, it's something like 1,300 containers.
1,300.
And now this one incident actually lost more than the annual average.
Yeah, but last year there were like 600 or 700 containers.
So
during the last 10 years, it averages down to 1,300.
Of course.
Yeah, which obviously is bad news, especially for the environment. If you have dangerous cargo on those containers, that will also be some pollution as well. Yeah. But I think we should treat all these articles in the media with just a grain of salt, and just also see those numbers into the larger, how they fit into the larger picture. And it's something that in the end it's unavoidable. It comes with the job of transporting cargo from point A to point B on very large ships during bad weather. It's normal people doing normal job.
As you said, it is an average value. I mean, the average is, we said 1,300. So, of course, I guess you have a huge case like the one now, the one Apus, or the MOL. What was
Comfort.
It? Comfort, ne?
7 years ago.
But if you say this was 7 years ago, and you have this average over 10 years, I mean, this already pushed up the numbers a lot. So usually it's way less to come to this average value of 1,300. What you also mentioned is the dangerous cargo. With the one now, it was 1,800 containers, or a bit more, 1,816. But out of those, 64 dangerous goods containers that were washed overboard. Where I actually heard a friend of mine asked me, how come those DG containers could be washed overboard? Why don't they store them in a safer position that in case something like this happens?
But this does happen.
This is the question. I think it depends very much also on the DG. Luckily, there were, from what I read, no chemicals and no really toxic stuff with it. The most dangerous for the environmental might have been some kind of batteries. A lot of it that was lost was fireworks.
Fireworks was the most.
From my understanding, I think doesn't have the huge environmental impact. But also it's very clear with fireworks, there's a very good reason why you don't store them in the middle of the ship in the hold. They have to be stored on open air in the front, where they unfortunately also are most subject to the elements, meaning easiest for weather conditions at all. But it's clear, I mean, you minimize the risk that way. And most likely the other DG that they carry that would have a huger environmental impact was stored in more safe positions. It's very difficult for non-nautical people, I think, to differentiate between all the different kinds of DG that are available, and that you have to treat them very, very differently. And of course, also you can't store them all in the same place, because otherwise, if something small happens there, it's going to be a huge disaster. Yeah.
Yeah, and they are stored in a special place. I mean, each ship has a cargo securing manual, as well as they have to comply with the IMDG code. So they give in each dangerous cargo, it's classed. I think it's in different classes of dangerous cargo. I think there are 9 classes or something, and or 9 main classes. But the chief mate on board and the staff ashore that is doing the planning, the port and the terminal, as well as the shipping company, they do take care and extra precautions on where do they store each dangerous cargo container on board. It can very well be in the hold, where it's very protected. You cannot have. I think it's impossible to have containers lost at sea which are already in the hold. But those that are stored on deck obviously are susceptible to
To the elements, yeah.
Yeah. So
okay, yeah, I remember. I think it was one of Marvin and I were studying together. So one of our favorite lectures.
Yeah,
learning this and then checking. Wait a second. Now I have this class. This needs to be stored at least I don't know, 1 row or 1 container height. You need to have certain distances between the containers. Okay, of course, for fireworks, it makes sense not to have them stored somewhere in the hold, because I remember from when I was painting down there, this gets like really expensive. Warm down there, hot. So you don't want to have something that's eligible for blowing up or likely to, that has the risk of blowing up. If you put it in a hold, might damage your hull if the whole thing blows up in the end.
Yeah, but go. This also thing. Of course, we have to wait for the final report. I'm really looking forward to see what were the, let's say, contributory factors, because definitely there are a lot of contributory factors, and it was just bad timing and bad luck, as always. But this also shows the importance of taking into account the weather during passage planning. And I'm just curious to see what, did you have any weather routing softwares on board?
We were actually not using weather routing software. We were receiving it still via fax. We were then evaluating it, of course. Nowadays, I mean, we have the software. There's the possibility it gets better with every day. You can have an actual software that is integrated with your navigation systems on board, which is a great thing. Especially now with those days, I mean, you hear this getting more those cases. Especially I have the feeling the weather gets more extreme with global warming or whatsoever. I read in one of the articles that they're not 100% sure yet, but there were indications that there were 16 or 18 meter high waves during this. Of course, for something like this, to avoid something like this, it's great to have a weather routing software. I don't know if Marvin used something like this on board.
We didn't have it integrated with anything. So we had a office computer in the back with some weather information and also with some proposals for route planning, but it wasn't integrating with the other systems at all. Sometimes it helped actually. We passed in the Baltic quite often one island, and it was very often the decision, depending on the strong winds in the Baltic in the wintertime, whether to pass it east or westwards. We were going northwards, and we can pass it on the east or on the west side.
But you were also still seeing on the computer, then
Just
having
seeing
those
on a computer,
printouts
basically we had no, we didn't need printouts. We were seeing it on the computer, and you could see actually a little bit also a rudimentary route, but not like you had it planned on the actual actors that we used. And then, but we had 2 routes prepared, and we switched, for example, from that. That was the most advanced weather routing I used. Before that, it was usually just, as you said, weather facts, and depending on that. But it's also very easy. I mean, especially for non-nautical people, if they read the whole thing, why did they go in the storm? Why didn't they just go around? Didn't they know the storm is coming? This is always one factor. You don't know exactly how it will be. I mean, it's not you're in the middle of the Pacific. It was the middle of the Pacific, literally, where it happened. So you don't really have that much reliable information on how the weather is developing. And when it's developing, it might be already too late because it's on a huge scale. And the second thing, of course, you always have to keep in mind, even the most advanced weather routing system, even if it's integrated with your systems, it's still a trade-off between safety and economical routes. So you will, of course, you can avoid basically the bad weather completely. You can try to sail closer to the equator, avoid making great circles close to the Arctic. But I wouldn't even say that even if you just see it from an environmental perspective, you need so much more fuel because of that it's also not better, because you have the trade-off between the risk of losing something which is polluting the environment and using much more fuel which is also polluting the environment. And the same thing, I think, is on an economic scale. You have the trade-off between being really, really safe, but spending a lot of money for the time of the delivery, again for the fuel and everything.
And this will affect the end customer in the end, because you'll have to pay more for.
It definitely affects the end price, the delivery price of the goods, yeah. On the other hand, of course, if you have too many high risks, well, you don't pay for it, but your insurance premiums will definitely go up. I mean, I doubt that an insurance company will just let this sit and not raise the premiums if you're continuing risky behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this shows yet also we are in 2021 almost, how difficult it is and how to predict weather, because it's we are dealing with a very complex system where not always the relationship between cause and effect, it's so obvious. So it is extremely difficult, even with the technologies and with the satellites that we have and with the weather balloons and everything, it's still difficult to predict weather. So this also shows somehow our way of, let's say, we want to control things and have certainty, and we don't like uncertainty, but it happened also, I've used several weather routing softwares, and they were a great tool, especially during passage planning. But it happened several times where there was a difference between the weather forecast and the actual situation. Okay. So if in the weather forecast I have average wave, like a significant wave height of 2 meters, in reality there might be even 4. It did happen. And it was, let's say, not a mistake, or it was not done on purpose. It's just, let's say, it was by the time that we received the weather forecast with those conditions, they were expecting a wave height of 2 meters, and then when we actually arrived there, it was 4 meters. Maybe the situations changed and so on. But yeah, it's kind of normal, and that's why. I think having to kind of not 100% rely on the forecast, but also try to get your information from different sources. So to have as many sources as possible, try to compare them, and also take a look at the sky and outside actually, and see how the situation is there, and
Definitely, yeah.
So it's basically it's a combination of factors. As you say, it's nice to have this tool that you can work with, and if you realize that you're heading for the storm, you should definitely try to avoid it. But as you said, you can't really rely. It's not 100% reliable. You can of course minimize risks with it, but you can also not, on the other hand, rely on it 100% because it might not. It might not. I mean, even people ashore realize that sometimes they say we'll have this and that weather, and it turns out to be something completely different. I mean, usually they don't predict snow, and you have afterwards you have 30 degrees plus, and people are going to the beach to have the extreme. But okay, it is a nice thing to use, or a great tool to use, but you need to have in mind. And yeah, then as Marvin also says, or as we all said, the fact is you can't go huge, you can't deviate hugely. If it is a critical situation and you want to save or keep the ship or the crew safe, it's definitely worth doing it. But I mean, also we had the saying, a smooth sailor, a smooth sea never made a sailor, or something like that.
Never made a skilled sailor.
Yeah. I mean, as long as you avoid extreme weather situations or weather phenomena, I think you're okay. If there's a bit of wind and waves, nobody minds on board, everybody who's going to sea. Of course, you should try to avoid the big storms.
But it's important to also know your resources. So
yeah.
To know what resources do you have on board to get as much information as possible to predict the weather. So you have the weather routing software, you might get a weather facsimile on Inmarsat-C. You can watch the barometer to see is the pressure going down or rising or falling. You have the hygrometer to check the humidity, the temperature. You can check the wind. So there are some, if you know, and all officers learn meteorology at school, there are some elements. I mean, as long as you take the information from all the available resources, you can make up like a picture model or like a mental model of what's going to happen.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think if you're heading, if you're heading for a big storm, I mean, some storms with this weather software would rather think you can avoid something that you might encounter in a day or two. So if you already know that the weatherman phenomenon is building up somewhere, you might be able to avoid it. You can, of course, track what's happening while you're on board. But if you don't realize that you're heading for a storm, even if you realize while going there, once you're at a point, you might not be able to, I don't know, turn back. You can't just turn around usually. So you were about to say.
For example, you can use the barometer if you don't expect any storm and suddenly the barometer goes down. Up. You will realize something is changing that you don't expect. But if you expect to go into a storm and you check your resources and think, okay, there will be a storm, there will be bad weather, but it's acceptable bad weather, then unfortunately the barometer readings will be in line with that. Because then you say, okay, it will match.
Yeah.
So there's always only so much you can do, I think, with your local resources. But definitely you can take also the information about the weather from different sources. This is something that actually many people do in their daily lives. I mean, if I'm putting the laundry out, I'm checking my phone usually for the weather, but if I'm not sure, I will check another source just to make sure that it's not out in the rain. The same, of course, applies on a much more tragic scale for a ship. That if your weather sources only come from one source with one algorithm behind the calculation, because in the end, weather forecasts are a calculation. They are based on this whole chaos theory, etc.
Yeah. But this also shows how difficult it is to make decisions that are quite complex and involves complex systems. Like, it's not that easy. Okay, you have an accident, you have this ship that lost containers, and then with the benefit of hindsight, it's very easy to go back and see, okay, why they should have done this, they should have done that. That it's, I think the safety experts call it like counterfactual reasoning. It didn't happen, so why? It's pointless to talk what should someone have done. Let's talk about the facts. So it's not that easy, especially for a captain that is under commercial pressure to deliver goods on time. It's extremely, you have to make decisions in a very complex environment.
But as you said, it's a very, very complex decision to make, because I mean, you're also the captain. Okay, he can be the hero afterwards if he says, you know what, I will refuse my orders, I will deviate from the course, and in the end, another ship that got into the same storm, gets destroyed or something. Then they would say, great decision that you actually avoided this. If he starts deviating from a course and in the end nothing happens, they might blame him. Why did you deviate? You could have gone through it. Everybody else did it. So it's this. Yeah, you have a lot of pressure. You have pressure from companies. You have pressure from from
I mean,
a lot of parties involved.
Yeah. Yeah, because to become a hero, something bad must happen. So you must do a good outcome out of that. So yeah, you are a hero. But that ship has passed the Atlantic and faced bad weather. I think on a monthly basis, because it is on a liner. So you have a predetermined route.
So 12 times he was a hero, and the 13th time he was a loser now.
Yeah.
And this hits the news.
This is what I want to say. You don't become a hero by avoiding something dangerous. This is just actually what people expect from you, and it is kind of your job actually, especially as a captain.
Yeah.
So you will not be celebrated as a hero. You might still be blamed. Why did you have 3 days delay? Couldn't you do the same avoidance with 2 days delay?
And as Razvan said, something else, I mean, something negative must have been happening. Even if you avoid it
and you arrive on time and everything gets fine, nobody talks about it.
But it basically another ship needs to keep the route, and something bad needs to happen, and then you would have the comparison to say, ooh, this is where we would have been. This could have happened to us. But yeah.
Yeah, then you can justify your actions. But did you ever see any cruise captain being celebrated as a hero after the Costa Concordia disaster? No, all the other cruise captains, they avoided these situations. They handled the whole situation a little bit better, but they don't get celebrated for it. The one person that doesn't do it correctly gets blamed. And I think this is always the reality, and I don't think this is something shipping specific. You will have the same as a truck driver, etc., or in any other office.
I think if nothing happens, you have normal people doing normal job. You just do your job, nothing happened. But when something happened, then you kind of have incompetent people and all this, the normal the public is expecting. But
what is your personal experience with the worst weather that you experienced on board, if I can ask?
Obviously, it was on, for me at least, it was on well-known areas of bad weather. So passing the Pacific during the winter. So we were going using obviously a great circle route to lower our fuel consumption and also arrive faster. And we were passing close to Aleutian Islands. So obviously there you were having bad weather. And in the Gulf of Biscay, where you have the westerlies. But it was kind of normal. We had some I've encountered some really, let's say, challenging weather conditions, but it was within acceptable limits and within acceptable, let's say, ship, all limits that relate to ship design and structural what's the technical terminology for this?
Within the stress limits. So.
Yeah, stress limits and everything. Yeah, okay. So it was manageable. Yeah,
I have to say I was actually quite lucky. I mean, we never really encountered any heavy weather, like heavy weather. I would say the weather was still okay. I mean, we had a bit rough sea. It might be a bit to the fact as well that I grew up sailing from an early age. I was on the sailing board the first time when I was a few months old. So I'm used to this. So I met one of our crew members in the crew one day, and he said, "Oh my God, this was a horrible night or something." And I told him, "But why? Everything for me it felt still fine." Okay, he was still a young guy who didn't go to sea for long, but he said he was suffering during that time. For me it was nothing. So maybe not underestimated a bit, but for me it seemed less. But I never really encountered anything really heavy with actual storms. I avoided the Pacific during winter. I never hit the Biscaya, at least not with on a big ship. Yeah, for you were also, you said at some point you were also in the Biscaya.
It was also in the Biscaya, but also not on a huge ship, because generally the huge ships also, they can deal with better waves sometimes. It was on a smaller feeder ship. In the Biscaya, we had some bad nights, wasn't something horrible. And then at one point, we had so much movement that there came, I think it was oil that reached a certain sensor, and we had a blackout. So everything ran on emergency. It was difficult to boot up it wasn't an Actis back then, actually, it was an ECDS. You know, as an A2 navigation, we tried to boot that up again, because the illumination wasn't so bright. In the emergency, it was a little bit difficult to handle, actually, the paper charts. It wasn't critical anyway. I was just dealing with it. I was a cadet back then. I was dealing with that on the side. They called me to investigate it, because the officers, they were having more important stuff to do. I mean, you know where you are. You're in the middle of the Biscay. It's not that crucial. They wanted to check out what is the actual weather, how they should turn the ship once the engine starts again, etc. It was interesting, definitely. I think it was my actual first contract, and it was a little bit shocking, but no cargo loss, nothing.
This is the worst, I think, to lose your propulsion during bad weather and stay adrift. I mean, your propulsion, it's one of the most important things that kind of keeps you. That helps you go out of bad weather and in case something happens. But yeah.
Well, this happened to us. This might be the worst thing that actually happened while I was on board. It wasn't during heavy weather, but we had a blackout, and actually we had 2 or 3 blackouts in a row. They booted it up again, it crashed again, and it happened in the Malacca Strait, shortly before we hit Singapore. And suddenly it was not panic on board, but it was like you were in this very highly frequented area, and suddenly the power went out, and the electrician, everybody started suddenly running, obviously to investigate. They brought the power back on. Shortly afterwards, it dropped again, and then they managed. Everything was okay, but yeah, it was smooth sea, everything good, but it was more the area where it happened. There was a critical thing, but.
Yeah, I think we were also fortunate enough to work for companies that were investing a lot on equipment on board, but I've also have colleagues that work on board ships that do not have so many latest technology available to help them make good decisions or to help them make decisions. Yeah, I think I'm just curious how, if we have an increase in development in terms of equipment on board the ship that it's used to make navigation safer and especially passage planning safer. What do you think that was there let's say an increase in development, and do shipping companies adopt latest equipment on board the ship in order to help crew make better decisions?
I think there's definitely an overall tendency to improve the equipment, to aid with decision making on board, to provide more accurate information, a more rounded picture of all available information. Of course, it depends always on the individual shipping company. I mean, every shipping company has their own things. This is always the bane of the shipping industry. I mean, on the one side, we have a lot of regulations, and sometimes it feels over-regulated. On the other hand, there are a lot of regulations missing. I mean, for all these things, for all these additional information tools, there's a lot of freedom there, which can be good, but also can mean that some companies that don't invest in it definitely will put their sailors to a disadvantage. Not necessarily the company themselves, but it will make the job of the people on board much more difficult. But the overall tendency, for sure, it's there, I think. I mean, when I was sailing as a cadet, there was no Actis yet. Nobody was talking about automated weather routing. Nobody was talking about calculating fuel-efficient routes, about taking into account surface currents, etc. I mean, the information is all there. Surface currents are nothing new. You can calculate them very well on the paper chart, and you can avoid them and plan your route accordingly, let's say. You can also take into account the weather information. All this was there, but it wasn't provided to you in an easily accessible way. And sometimes this old weather facsimile, what you also said, I felt there were quite limited in the information they provided.
Indeed, there was. I mean, you should. Sometimes you are using the weather facsimile information to just confirm whatever was provided by the weather routing software. I mean, theoretically, you should not have any differences because, it depends also on the sources. Yeah, but I think that it's safe to say that, as with any adoption of technology, it goes down to cost. So if the ship owner can see a reduction of costs, especially for fuel efficiency, then they will adopt any technical or any technology available in order to help bring down the cost of fuel. And obviously, fuel efficiency, I think, has many sources or many contributory factors. So in one hand, you have the design of the ship itself. Then you also have the weather that it's also influencing the fuel efficiency. So it's not only down to the weather, but you also have the ship design itself. So there are multiple factors that all together.
That's actually an interesting point. Didn't you say something that there was a sister or similar ship to the Apus, to one Apus that also lost some containers like a year ago?
No, it was this year actually.
This year.
I read about it briefly. I don't ask me for the name now. It was also one of this one company, and I think they were on the same trade, also in the Pacific. They lost less container. That's why it didn't become that big issue in the news. But they lost on the exact same route. I think they lost containers.
Okay, then it might also be a routing problem, but there's definitely also the factor of ship design that comes into it. How easy it is for certain ships to fall into especially into asynchronous rolling and lose something. But maybe that's a better topic for another time.
Yeah, especially with large container ships, you have these problems with parametric rolling and synchronous rolling. And this was we are having systems on board, sensors placed on the different locations on board the ship, and we were constantly monitoring the rolling. And this is something that each officer was paying great attention to, because it was a normal, let's say, expected risk on ships of such type. You have Ro-Ro ships that have quite a small draft and huge, very high freeboard. Same goes with container ships. So if you work on a bulker or tanker, I hope that you are more.
You have different dangers there. But again, you were supported by technology, actually. As you said, your company was implementing sensors. It was built in the ships.
It was built within the ship. I was fortunate enough to have resources available where I could gather information and take decisions. Okay, now it's time to change the route because the ship is started rolling too much. And we were receiving alarms and so on. So there was kind of a smart prediction, let's say. So if the ship was starting rolling and the system was deviating that these are the conditions for a parametric rolling to happen, then the system would generate an alarm, so we could either reduce the speed or change the course. But this was obviously, this equipment is not mandatory. Yeah? So in the end, the ship owner to install an equipment takes the decision based, okay, is it mandatory? No. Then does it saves me money, or does it influence my bottom line? No. Then I don't do it. So
needs to impose a certain risk for you to do it. If they don't make it mandatory, either it needs to save you money, or it needs to you need to say, I can install that type of sensor or that type of warning system, and if I don't get warned and this actually happens, there will be such a loss that I will rather preventively install those sensors, even though it's not mandatory. But I think it's not a problem of the shipping industry itself. I think you have this in all industry. It is always, as long as everything works, nobody will say anything. Then something big happens. They were all, nobody was sleeping. They were all days at a time awake, or they didn't take that precaution on any industry. As long as everything is okay, nobody will mention it, and everybody will, we say, to keep the eyes closed or something. To actually, where there's a saying, to keep one eye closed and you say, it's okay. The moment that something happens, suddenly everybody comes and says, how could this have happened? Why didn't anybody?
But that's actually maybe one good takeaway from the whole thing. While it has to be seen into perspective, as you said before, the loss of the containers, and there are a lot of contributing factors, it's definitely something that the industry as a whole can learn from. Once it is analyzed more closely, because it was one of the big incidents, and unlike the small incidents that the lower average, the big incidents usually provide something. I mean, why did they lose so much more containers than on average, etc.? What was the big changes there? Maybe in the end it was just a series of misfortunate events.
Is the industry learning though? I have the feeling that it's not, especially when blame comes into place. It's kind of, you cannot learn.
Blame doesn't help anything.
Blame doesn't help anything.
Yeah,
blame
but
never
we
helps.
are still, as much as anyone want to promote this just culture that is more retributive rather than punishing. It's not. I mean, when it comes to actually implementing a just culture and not blaming, it doesn't happen, because as soon as you have an accident, the media starts blaming. So the learning will never happen, because it's a contradiction there. I believe that you cannot learn because imagine that the crew is at the front line. The crew on board the ship is at the front line. They are facing the problems and they know best what is going on. But in order to learn, or the shipping company to learn and change the procedures and everything, then you must create an environment where people are able to speak up their mind and speak up the knowledge, speak up the things that they see, or they think that it's not okay. But if they fear retribution and if they fear that they will be punished, they will never speak.
Yeah, okay.
So
this is something else, in my opinion. The whole fear of near misses, retribution even for near misses, etc. This will hinder the actual reporting scheme that took in place. But I think from many big events, there was a takeaway. For example, Exxon Valdez definitely was a lesson learned for the industry. There were consequences from it. On the other hand, you're right, it might not be with everything. Personally, I can't remember any lesson learned after Costa Concordia, for example. But I'm not in the cruise industry, so maybe inside of the cruise industry, they adopted their policies. Because anyway, he was violating policies and not following some rules. So I don't know if there was any change there. But I think that the potential is there, and it needs to be seen what factors are there. So that if it's just a misfortunate events, then there's nothing we can learn from it. But at least identifying all the factors that can come in and see what was so different in this case compared to lesser cases.
Yeah, but you don't have to wait for a bad outcome to happen. You can learn from good outcomes.
In this case, I think
but it doesn't put the pressure. It doesn't put the pain there.
Yeah, you have to be a bit more proactive.
I think that with the Exxon Valdez, it was a huge thing. So the steps had to be taken. I think the problem is if you have cases where the outcome is not that critical, then it's less likely to have a lesson learned afterwards and to do changes. It should definitely be done. I mean, we shouldn't have this. We shouldn't blame people. We should see what went wrong. How can we change it? How can we improve it? This is what every reasonable person would probably say. And we know that in practical...
As with any story, you have different narratives. You have an external narrative that goes out to the public, and then you have an internal narrative on actually what actually happened. You might even have a third narrative from the point of the people who were actually doing the job. So it's very difficult to drill down and find what actually happened. But I'm really a bit skeptical with these lessons learned, because it's a word thrown out there, and because if you take a closer look, it says what are the lessons learned so this accident doesn't happen again. Well, the probability tells you that this accident most likely will never happen again, because even if you learned something or not, that particular accident with that ship going back into the same position, losing 1,800 containers will never happen. So the probability is very low.
Is clear.
So even if you don't do anything, things will not, nothing bad will happen.
Okay, this is something that we can see. I mean, that might even be worth another episode to
Yeah.
see if we can talk a bit. I mean, because there were loads of incidents, but maybe we can see in one of the episodes to see what incidents did we have, what changes actually came out of it. I think for today we basically we discussed it, and I think we're coming to an end. Yeah, it was great. I enjoyed it a lot, guys, for first episode. Yeah. Any last thoughts, words for?
No, I think as a key takeaway was to always take a step back and put things into perspective and try to show some empathy and put ourselves in the shoes of people on board and try to see why it makes sense to them to do what they did. And try to understand their environment and the pressures and so on. It's very easy to sit outside and just see as an external how things went and just draw conclusions based on and not facts that actually happened.
Definitely.
And I think it's worth digging it deeper and exploring this on next episodes.
Yeah, I think it would be an idea. Some smart person just told me once, no officer or captain is actually going to their watch having in mind, I want to screw it up now.
Yeah.
It was actually you. We talked about it a year ago. You said,
I mean,
but because this is not the intention, you always need to consider everything. What was involved? There are a lot of factors. But
I haven't heard in my entire life a person that wants to do their job in a bad way. Everyone goes to work to do a good job. Everyone with the best intention. It's just things happen that we don't expect a bad outcome. Now, but unfortunately, we have the media and others. It's very easily blaming incompetence, loss of situational awareness, and other labels, these are nothing more than just labels for human error. And if we don't go past human error, we will never learn. We'll never create the environment to learn.
This
is the problem.
Yeah. But okay, I talked too much. So
Perfectly fine.
Let's put a pause to it and see you guys next month.
Next month, I guess. So for that time, Merry Christmas.
I wish you happy
Happy New Year.
holidays. I wish you happy holidays as well. And
same to you guys.
Let's get together next year then.
And let's talk nautical again.
Yeah. Let's talk nautical.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.